Are there people in the party and in the government that are more open to? I get the impression from looking at the reaction to this book, to Tombstone, that there has been some people, powerful people in China, who are grateful for the sort of reassessment. Is it a little bit more complicated than you seem to have suggested? Are there forces that want to understand what happened?
It's always more complicated with China. It's never, there are always layers and layers and layers within layers. And I mean, what we have seen in recent months has been this sort of tremendous battle playing out over press freedom, and we can only kind of guess what's happening behind the lines. But even when it comes to these moves that have been taken against the media, in recent days we saw a magazine, Caixin, which is quite well known for its bold investigative reporting. They had an article censored, and it was a fairly harmless article, but it was about the necessity for freedom of expression, that delegates to a party conference should be able to express themselves, and they had it censored. And they pushed back. They published an article in English saying that this article had been censored, and re-interviewing the person who was censored, who was saying this is terrible, and he couldn't understand why it was censored. The reason given was that there was illegal content, but no, that wasn't specified what that meant. And I mean, these kind of things do show us that there are still some portions of the media, some parts of the media that are not willing to take these limitations lying down. They're still trying to speak out against it and to raise their voice. But I think the truth is that there are all kinds of ideological struggles happening in China, and one of the casualties is the press.
Thank you so much for your remarks. I was just thinking tonight, there's 1.3 billion people in China. Why do you think Yang was the one person who decided to write this book?
I mean, I think a lot of it is to do with his character. He's very tenacious, he's very determined, but also a certain amount was to do with the kind of access that he was able to get. He was able to leverage his position as a Xinhua reporter and use that to gain access to the archives, and to use a certain amount of cunning to do so as well. And I think the fact perhaps that he is slightly older, that he's not supporting a family. Often economic pressures are another reason why young Chinese journalists find it harder to not to obey the rules, because they have families to feed, children to clothe. And I think maybe that too did play a part, but I think a lot of it is to do with his own character, and also his own personal background, the fact that the man he saw as his father died in the Great Famine, and he had felt very guilty about that for so many years. So I think he was also driven by a great personal impetus to try and understand the bigger picture, because he had only seen one small chapter unfolding in front of his eyes. And I think that personal impetus was also a strong driver to help him understand what he saw unfolding before his eyes, how that was whether it was being replicated across the country, and how.
An award like that, and the kind of attention that his not being able to come has generated, is that protective or is that detrimental to his well-being?
It's always hard to know. It's a really good question. It's very difficult to know, and that's something that if you're a journalist in China, you have to think about all the time. If I write about this person saying sensitive things, does it protect them, or does it make them a massive target? And, there's no real answer to this, but he was attacked in the state-run media, and he did write a response to that attack. And in that response, he did say that he had thought very carefully about whether to, every time he's offered an award, he thinks about whether to accept it or not, and whether it will make him a target or not. So I think that this, he himself realized that there could be some problems for him, but at the same time, as he put it, it's a it's a journalistic award, and I think that to a certain extent, raising the profile of what happened to the fact that he has not been allowed to accept this award has given more coverage to his work and what he has done, and to the plight of journalists in China. And I think probably these are factors that he has weighed up. Yes.
Louisa, thank you very much for these remarks. As I was listening to you, I thought back on a book I read many, many, many years ago, a book I'm sure you're very familiar with, China Alive in a Bitter Sea, by another, one of the very first of the American journalists to go back to China in the 1970s, Fox Butterfield, who in fact did a degree here at Harvard. I remember in that book the great difficulties that he recounted in being followed and having a hard time finding people who would even talk to him, and just the great frustrations that he encountered as he was trying to carry out his job in China. And so I'd like to, I don't want it to be a challenge, but I want to complicate the narrative that you've given by saying we're at some kind of a new moment. Because it seems to me that, in fact, it's more of the same thing that we have seen in China for at least 40 years, not more, of the fact that China is not, and mainland China is not an open society, that there are very many limits on freedom of the press, despite what it says in the Constitution, and that those very limits and the tremendous obstacles put in the way of any journalist, whether Chinese or non-Chinese, in carrying out their work, is one of the things that makes journalism in China both so important and also and I don't know how you're going to take this, but I'm also argue somewhat attractive in that it is so hard and it badly needs to be done, but it can only be done by people with special qualities. And you must have known, I'm sure, before you went to China, that you were going to have a hard time. And the French journalists you described who were showing people pictures of the tank man, I mean, I don't know what they were thinking, but I mean, if you thought you could get away with that, you just don't know what you're doing. So that's not to say you shouldn't do it, but there's a tension here between wanting things to be open and yet having things not being open, in fact, makes what you do even more urgent and more important.
But the point is that you sometimes can get away with these things. I don't think it's true to say that it's more of the same. I mean, we've had periods of loosening, of opening, where it's much easier to navigate these things. And then we've had periods of tightening, and I think we're in a period of tightening which is quite unlike any that we've seen before, and partly because the period of opening that we saw was also unprecedented. I mean, the existence of Weibo, China's Twitter and Weixin, really were a new reality for Chinese who wanted to publish their own things that were free from state control. And that didn't last forever, but it meant that when the tightening came, it had to be more intense. So I don't think, yes, it's not free and it never has been, but I think in this day and age, given the existence of the internet, of mobiles, of all these possibilities for communication and increased communication, it seems so difficult to comprehend that living in China, all these possibilities are shrinking. And I think you might see it as fun or challenging, to work in China. But I mean, the flip side to that is that you really, there's the kind of panic of waking up in the night when you have a phone call saying your source has been detained, of wondering, was it something that person said to me that has landed them in prison for so many years? Of talking to people who are so nervous that, they're sweating, they're shaking, and of, knowing that the people that you talk to are under surveillance, of having these conversations with people as their surveillance team is sitting on the other side of the restaurant and thinking, my God, what am I doing? What are the possible consequences? It's that kind of thing is not fun. It's really, really, really hard because you're taking responsibility for something that you really cannot control.
Well, I certainly didn't mean to suggest it was fun. I didn't use those words.
Sorry.
But at the same time, as a student in China in the early 1980s, people I hung out with were all followed by the police, as was I. That was how it was. And people who choose to speak with you or any journalist, again, wherever they might be from, know perfectly well the risks that they are taking. You're not, don't you have to make some sort of, at some point, to keep from losing your mind, you must have some way to reconcile the fact that some of the risk lies with the people you speak with, right? Otherwise it's all on your head, and that's a burden that would be very hard for any journalist, I would think.
Oh, absolutely. People make a decision to speak to you, and when they do, I think as a journalist, it's your responsibility to tell their story as fairly and as clearly and as fully as you can, and to understand that they have decided knowingly to take that risk. But I think one of the big problems is that it's so difficult to know what the risk is. You can write, like Yang, his book came out in 2008, and yet now, 8 years later, here it is rearing up its ugly head amid a whole new atmosphere of hysteria and name-calling, and that again is making him a target. So the risk is not static, and that's something that's very, very hard to deal with as a journalist, because it's always there and it can always come back. Yes.
Thank you so much for coming and speaking on Yang's behalf. We are honored for you to be here and speaking about the issues in China. I'm curious, in the future, what do you see as the challenges and for journalists in the future? And do you think it'll get worse or better? And you can just prophesize in the future for all of us.
I think the challenges now are very intense. We've seen in the last 3 weeks, we saw the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, visiting the main news outlets like CCTV and telling them, he said, the media's surname is party. So this was a way of telling the media that they must serve their traditional function as a propaganda tool of the party. And one thing that the Chinese authorities are very worried about is the economy. As economic growth slows down, China's entering what they call the new normal. And they've even, there have been editorials in the state-run media saying that the media's role is to rebuild trust in the party. So I think that the problems will be, the problems will be intense for anyone who wants to try anything more, who steps out of line. I think the ideological lines have been very, very firmly set, and we've seen a series of cases where journalists and bloggers have been punished quite vindictively for things that seem to us to be quite minor. So, I think there are many difficulties for journalists in China, and one of the main ones is actually doing anything that is actually an act of journalism. But also, I think we are seeing a talent drain because young Chinese don't want to be journalists anymore. It's hard work, pays really badly, it's really stressful, And, there's really no upside. So I think in future that's likely to be one of the problems that Chinese journalism faces. But I think the bigger challenge is, doing anything which is not perfectly following the party diktat. And, we see it now. We see, if you look at the front pages of all the main newspapers on a given day, you see the same picture, the same headline, the same layout. So it's kind of going back sort of 20, 30 years to an era of such tight ideological control. And as the economy continues to get worse, I think that those controls are likely to tighten further still, which is, hard to see how that will even happen.
So I'm going to reveal my ignorance a little bit. You mentioned a couple of times publishing kind of as an act of defiance. And what does that even mean? Especially even, 15 years ago. Now there's sort of an internet, so it's like, okay, you could put it somewhere, maybe it can be found, but what does that, practically speaking, mean?
Well, a book like Yang's cannot be published in China, so you would have to publish it in Hong Kong. And then maybe people will buy it in Hong Kong and carry it back to China. But even that is becoming much more difficult. We're seeing publishers in Hong Kong who publish books critical of the Chinese leadership. We saw 5 of them being kidnapped and taken to China. And publishing sensitive material on the internet, it is harder still. That's not easy. If you open... So there have been moves made so that if you want to open an account on Weibo or Twitter, then you have to use your real name. If you publish something which the authorities don't like, there are various steps by which either they make it so nobody can see it or they just close your account down. If you open again, then you get closed down again. So, the internet is not like the internet here. You can publish stuff and it'll stay up for a while, but there's not the same kind of openness. And it's interesting if you look at the kind of thing that gets censored on the Chinese internet. It's also stuff that often we in the West would find perfectly unthreatening. So the most censored viral post last year was actually a small picture of a toy plastic Winnie the Pooh bear in a little car. And this was censored because someone put it out on the day of this big military parade. So it was a comment on President Xi Jinping, who looks a little bit like Pooh Bear because he's kind of tubby. And he was surveying the troops in his car with his head sticking out of the top of the car. So he looked like Pooh Bear in this car. And this was the most censored viral post of the year. So, often it's not necessarily even the kind of sensitive topics that get censored. It's much lighter stuff and sometimes sarcastic stuff. So publishing stuff online is challenging, and we're even seeing censorship now on Weixin, which is like WhatsApp. So if I sent you a message and I'm not even publishing it openly, that could be censored. There was a case even several years ago of a poet who sent a poem to some friends over Skype, and he got 7 years in prison just for the act of sending a poem to somebody else over Skype. So even though China has an internet, it is not the same as our internet, and it doesn't operate in the same way. Last question. Okay.
I'm curious, you touched on this subject in your book, about the wave of Chinese students who go abroad to US, Australia, New Zealand, and Xi Jinping's daughter was here for 4 years, although Yang Jisheng could not come for a dinner. But so what is the impact of these people who come back to China? Is there any impact about when they...
It's a really good question, and it's really hard to tell. I mean, Chinese students are now the biggest group of international students in the US, and they're coming in greater and greater numbers. But I think one of the impacts of Tiananmen was that it brought in this campaign of patriotic education in the early 90s, and that was very intense, and was patriotic education not just in schools, but in the media and films and entertainment, in every area of life. And I think that that has led to students, young students, that are quite nationalistic, and when they come overseas, sometimes when they hear other versions of their country's history, versions that they're not familiar with, they tend not to believe it. They think it's a conspiracy, it's a Western plot, and they sometimes will get very worked up and argue, and, you know, just in a way, kind of, they double down and it confirms what they believe. But you do get other, other students who come overseas and they learn stuff about China that they never knew, and it really changes the way that they think about their own country. And I mean, when I was on book tour for my book, often I would get young Chinese students in the audience, and sometimes it would be intensely emotional because they would be seeing things that they'd never seen before and never even heard about. And often they would say to me, well, what should I do? What do I do now, now that I've found this out? And I would say, I can't tell you what to do, but talk about it. Tell other people what you have found out, because silence is not the answer. Only by letting other people know what you now know can you expand knowledge within China. So I think that there are really different responses, but it will be really interesting to see in the next few years what the impact is of those Chinese students that have been overseas and then are going back to China. And I should say, at the very last note, that I actually got a tweet that made me so happy. I got a tweet from a Chinese student who said, I'm a Chinese student studying in the US, and I just want you to know that I've just translated your book.